Good morning and welcome. My name is Reverend Kate Wilkinson, and I am so glad that you are here with us this morning. Each Sunday we light our chalice as a symbol of our faith, and this morning I've invited Pastor Brenda Haywood to light our chalice for us.
The reading this morning is called Prophet in the Wilderness of Racism. And it came to pass in those days that the Spirit of God visited a young woman whose name was Rosa. God multiplied her strength and her determination. She would not be moved. And all Montgomery looked upon her and wondered. And God raised up a prophet in the midst of these people, whose name was Martin. The courage of Rosa should not perish, but it should be extended and multiplied, and indeed it was done. For the words of the prophet fell upon the ears of the nation. The people listened. A dream was dreamed. A vision was provided. A highway was created through the desert of racism. The lowly and the ignored were lifted up and exalted. And in the rough places, Selma, Atlanta, Birmingham, Memphis, Boston, Washington, D.C., the truth was made plain. But the truth was denied. The prophet was slain. Thick darkness covered the land, yet the promise declared by the prophet would not be overcome. In the darkness, the light continues to shine. The people are called forth. Their strength doubled, their vision extended. For the Spirit of God is upon them, and the time is at hand that they should deliver the nation from despair. And so it is given to us in these latter days that by our efforts, as God shall help us, the oppressed shall receive justice. The righteous shall receive their reward, and peace shall flow down like a mighty stream, as the prophet Martin did declare it upon us. Amen. Peace. Shalom. Salam. Ashe, ashe. May it be so.
Spirit of life, we come to this house bringing our boldest dreams. May this be a time of collective dreaming, healing, seeking, and praying. A time for affirmation of self, for the tending and healing of wounds, for the nurturing of hope, the cultivation of gratitude, and the building of justice. Grant us the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, courage to change the things we can, and wisdom to know the difference. Amen. On August 28, 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, and to an audience of 250,000 people, delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech. It was a defining moment of the American civil rights movement. 50 years later, his words are still echoing. He began with a reference to Lincoln. 50 years ago, a great American, in whose symbolic shadow we stand today, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. He goes on. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languishing in the corners of American society and finds himself an exile in his own land. So we have come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we have come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. So we have come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. 50 years later. We have come such a long way in 50 years, but we have not delivered the full value of that promissory note. The blatant racism of the 1960s has been replaced by a more subtle racism, a racism built into the very foundation of our institutions. And so it is there, at the foundations, that we must look 50 years later as we continue to work to make justice a reality for all God's children. 5 years ago, I took a course called White People Challenging Racism. This spring, many of you had the opportunity to take a similar class here at the UU Meeting House. Next month, those who took the class will gather with members of the congregation who identify as people of color to reflect on the experience and what they learned. And in the fall, we will begin our multicultural anti-racism discussion group. I am so grateful that this community is willing to engage in this discussion and this work. Part of being on a spiritual journey is to realize that we are never done learning, never done thinking and seeing in new ways. So this morning I offer some stories that invite us to think about systemic racism. I first shared these stories with you last January on Martin Luther King weekend, and the worship committee asked that I share them again today in honor of the 50-year anniversary of the I Have a Dream speech. Throughout the service, we will draw on the words of Martin Luther King, not just from his I Have a Dream speech, but also from many other moving speeches that he delivered in his lifetime. Let us begin.
I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Martin Luther King Jr., letter from Birmingham Jail, April 16, 1963.
The first story that I share with you is one from ABC's Nightline and their series about race in America called America in Black and White. Commentator Ted Koppel starts out with this thought-provoking introduction. This business of how we perceive the reality of racism in America, he says, depends in large measure on who we are, where we live, how much money we earn, and of course, whether we are black or white. He goes on to introduce a story that made me think more critically about how racism can exist deep within the structures of society, and not just on the visible surface of our personal interactions. About 5 months ago, something happened in Buffalo, New York, he says. It was a traffic accident. I may have been aware of it at the time, he continues, but if I was, it didn't really register. I may have read about it in the paper and then immediately forgot about it. Several of my black colleagues here at ABC heard about the incident and were outraged. This, they argued, was a clear example of the sort of insidious racism that white people rarely notice and almost never acknowledge. Here is what happened. Cynthia Wiggins, a 17-year-old black woman, was hit and killed by a truck on Walden Avenue. The driver who struck her could not tell the color of her skin as she weaved through traffic at a stoplight. In fact, he did not even see her. But the black community of Buffalo rose up incensed at her death, pointing to it as a clear example of racism. The white community equally strongly pushed back. To be honest with you, I think it's ridiculous that racism is even brought into a situation like this, says a white man when interviewed in his local bar. Race is the excuse for everything these days, says a white woman. Anything that happens that's bad, it seems like that's the excuse. But on the other side, Andrew Clark, a friend of Cynthia's, and also black, says it's racism, and that's what caused her death. racism is still alive. Just before a commercial break, Ted Koppel asks, "So why do feelings run so high? Why is there such a difference of opinion, clearly split along racial lines?"
I remember another experience I used to have in Atlanta. I went to high school on the other side of town, to the Booker T. Washington High School. I had to get the bus in what was known as the 4th Ward and ride over to the west side. In those days, rigid patterns of segregation existed on the buses so that Negroes had to sit in the back of the buses. Whites were seated in the front, and often if whites didn't get on the buses, those seats were still reserved for whites only. So Negroes had to stand over empty seats. I would end up having to go to the back of the bus with my body. But every time I got on that bus, I left my mind up on the front seat. And I said to myself, one of these days, I'm going to put my body up there where my mind is. From the autobiography of Martin Luther King, Jr.
Cynthia was a single mom who never graduated from high school. She was from the east side of Buffalo, a rough neighborhood. She was eligible for some public assistance, but needed to get at least part-time work to support herself and her baby. She didn't have a car, but getting work in her neighborhood was nearly impossible. There was no supermarket, no hardware store, no family restaurant in that part of town. Hope came in the form of a new mall being built in the nearby suburban neighborhood of Cheektowaga. Many of Cynthia's neighbors, a third of them in fact, took the city bus to work. A half hour on the number 6 bus would get Cynthia to the suburbs where the jobs were, but not to the new Galleria Mall in Cheektowaga. When the transit authority made plans to reroute the number 6 bus by 1 mile so that East Side residents could access the mall officials and city officials of Cheektowaga made it clear that they did not care to have the Route 6 serve the mall. They did not want the problems of the East Side coming to their side. They did not want the Black inner-city community in their mall. A year after opening, the mall agreed to put in a bus stop, but not for the number 6. To reach the Walden Galleria, Cynthia could take the number 6 to the Thruway Mall, a mall with a predominantly Black clientele, and transfer to a shuttle after waiting 30 to 90 minutes. Not a promising option in the frigid Buffalo winters. But Cynthia needed a job. So she took the other option of getting off the number 6 bus at the nearest stop to the Galleria on Walden Avenue, a 7-lane stretch of road, including an on and off ramp to the highway, and no crosswalk or sidewalk. So it was here that Cynthia got off each day for her new job at a fast food restaurant in the Galleria, dodging cars and trucks to cross 7 lanes of traffic. And it was here that Cynthia lost her life when she was struck by an 18-wheeler truck at the intersection as the light turned green halfway through crossing. To some people, maybe even most, the charge of racism here seems like a stretch. But to the Black residents of Buffalo, who already felt like second-class citizens when the mall management actively impeded their access to the new mall, this incident was absolutely related to race. A sanitized, guiltless racism buried under the transportation system and city planning. After Cynthia's death, the bus company and the mall agreed for the need for a new bus stop at the Walden Galleria. Ted Koppel concludes his report by saying, "Passengers of the number 6 bus will no longer have to dodge traffic on Walden Avenue." It is, in a way, Cynthia's legacy.
On some positions, cowardice asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? And vanity comes along and asks the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right? And there comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe nor politic nor popular, but he must do it because conscience tells him it is right. The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of convenience, but where he stands in moments of challenge, moments of great crisis and controversy. And this is where I choose to cast my lot today. Martin Luther King, from his anti-war speech at New York's Riverside Church, April 4th, 1967.
This is the true story of Byron Green and Max Holland. They are about the same age, work for the same company, and make the same income. They even live in the same neighborhood. Byron is black and Max is white. It would seem on the surface that these men are equal in our society. In fact, Byron and Max are the co-directors of California Newsreel, the company that produced the PBS television series Race, The Power of an Illusion, from which I take their story. On the surface, they have the same life. But if you compare their net assets, Max, who is white, has twice as much wealth as Byron, who is black. Why is there such a big difference? Has Byron not worked as hard as Max? Not been as prudent? Did Byron not prioritize his studies and go to a good college? They have the same job. So can we really say that Byron has been discriminated against? What happened? What roles have race and wealth played in their life stories? Let's get back to Byron and Max. Have you been thinking about why there might be such a big gap in their assets? Let's take a look, starting with when their parents each bought their first homes. In 1951, the Greens bought a 2-story duplex in one of the areas of Chester, Pennsylvania, that would rent or sell to African Americans. The Greens scraped together $1,000 for the down payment and mortgaged the $5,500 remaining balance. The Hollands married in 1948. A financial gift from their parents and a low-interest government VA loan allowed the Hollands to stretch their resources and move to a new suburban development on Long Island. In 1952, they bought a home in all-white Merrick for $21,500. Now let's take a look at how Byron and Max's parents made a living. In the 1950s, job opportunities for black people were still very limited. Mr. Green worked as a lab attendant at a nearby refinery. He'd say black men were the last hired and the first fired. Mrs. Green provided domestic help for white families in the middle-class suburbs. Mr. Holland financed his college education through the GI Bill. After graduating, he got a job as a management trainee for a big New York textile firm, where he worked for the next 15 years. The sales, technical, and management staff were entirely white. Byron and Max now live in the same neighborhood, but let's look at Byron and Max's neighborhoods growing up. When manufacturing crashed, many people left Chester, and the area became increasingly segregated. Those who stayed faced higher taxes to maintain public services and schools. While their income remained the same, the Greens saw their expenses climb and their neighborhood begin to deteriorate. Meanwhile, property values were good and getting better for Max's family. He and his brothers enjoyed good schools, parks, and libraries. In 1965, Mr. Holland started his own business by tapping into his home equity and borrowing money from an uncle. His business did well, and he sent all 3 of his children to private colleges. But Byron also went to college. He received an academic scholarship to an Ivy League school. Because of his family's uncertain financial situation, though, he's always exercised a conservative approach to his personal finances. Max's personal wealth building began at the age of 13 with bar mitzvah checks from friends and relatives. By the time he was 18, Max could use his savings and money from his parents to travel, explore his interests, and go to college worry-free. In the year 2000, the Greens sold their home in Chester for $29,500, a negligible increase in value considering the remodeling and improvements they had put into it over 40 years. This amount has not gone far to provide for Byron's parents in old age. At the time of the sale, Chester's population was 76% Black. In 1991, the Hollands sold their home for $299,000, 14 times what they paid for it, and were able to retire comfortably to the Berkshire Mountains. They also helped all of their children with down payments on their own homes. At the time of the sale, Merrick was still 95% white. In 1994, Byron financed the purchase of a condominium and continues to make monthly mortgage payments today. He also needs to look after his parents' finances and must be ready to pitch in whenever unforeseen expenses arise. With help from his parents, Max bought his own house in 1985. Today, his parents are financially secure, and his home is all paid for and appreciating value. Max is free to focus on his future, to provide a safety net or launching pad for his own children. As you can see, in one generation, discrimination makes a big difference in the relative wealth of these 2 people. At the time their story was recorded a few years ago now, the average white family had 8 times the wealth of the average non-white family. Even at the same income level, whites have, on average, twice the wealth of Black families. Wealth isn't just about luxury. It's also the starting point for the next generation. Until the wealth gap is addressed, say Byron and Max, whites will still continue to have an advantage over non-whites, generation after generation.
There again, we hear a lot of talk about the fact that the Negro should lift himself by his own bootstraps. Now, I believe in a certain aspect of that, and this is what we try to do. I do always point out the other side, that the problem is that Negroes have not always had the resources in many ways to just do it by themselves. And it's a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. And it's even worse if you have a boot and somebody's standing on the boot and they're telling you to lift yourself by your own bootstraps. Martin Luther King, from speech at Operation Breadbasket meeting, 1967.
So after sharing these stories with you, I don't have any answers to offer, but I do have this feeling of being uncomfortable. And I think that's a start. a step in the right direction, a recognition that things are not right with the world, that there is work to be done. And I end with these words, spoken 50 years ago this week. I say to you today, my friends, even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. Amen.